So I'd like to put your hands together to welcome Bob. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. How many, have we got teachers here? Have we got some teachers? That's terrific, okay. And some parents of high school kids or primary school kids? Okay, good. Because that's going to be really quite what we're about here. Now, the question is, what do we know about friendships of children with disability? If you've got a son or daughter with a disability, you know that this is an issue, is that the friendships are in fact an issue. The first question is, do they have more friendships in regular schools rather than segregated schools? And they do. They not only have more friends, they tend to have a reciprocal relationship. In other words, their friends report that they are actually getting benefit out of the friendship as well. On the other hand, if you're in a segregated school, some research indicates that around about 60% report having only one friend and meeting that friend at school only because, of course, they bust in from across town. So the reality is that, in fact, the child is better and more likely to have friendships at regular school. And even if the student has got a major disability, like profound intellectual disability, they found the rates of social bullying about 5 times higher than if the child is in a segregated school. Now, there's of course a big but about that. They experience a lower social standing to their peers. In other words, they're seen as a less valuable person, if you like, than their peers. And we'll talk about it later in terms of as they get older, it seems to be that you need adult intervention for this to actually occur. Okay, so this is something we designed in about 1996, a friend of mine, trying to get a handle on what is inclusion, what do we mean? Because it's got to mean the same for anyone, not just children with a disability. It's got to mean just any child. First of all, you've got to be physically there. You've got to be in it to win it. If you're not included, if you're not physically there, you obviously can't be included. Socially included, that's the big one that we're after, and we'll be talking obviously quite a bit about that. But to be socially included, you really need to be transacting the same tasks. If you're doing something totally different to everyone else, it's unlikely that you'll be seen as included. If you were learning the French down the back of this room with a helper and everyone else was learning about circles at school, would you feel included? And of course the answer is no. So we need to have the person included in the same curriculum as the rest of the class. If the class is doing nuclear physics, the student with profound disabilities is doing nuclear physics in the same class. So you can see that's a bit of a challenge, but we actually do that. In terms of other things we've got there, we've got the relevance, the potency of the situation, the self-image and the image in the eyes of the other children and the expectations, but it's particularly the social that we wanted to have a look at because that's a major issue. So that's basically what we've talked about there. They need to be there, transacting the same tasks. Skills tend to be picked up as a result of the education and expectations define who we are, as I think Laura particularly pointed out this morning. Now, what happens if you go, we've pulled a child out for a special class? You know, you'll be really benefit from having their special class in that. Well, actually, that tends to reduce the social inclusion. There's a wonderful paper, it's called Joanna, How He Comes and Goes. That was how the child was actually seen by the classmates in that situation. Just think about the logic of it. We're going to have a child has to learn, already with the social difficulties, has to learn 2 environments, 2 teachers, 2 sets of kids in half the time. That's probably not going to work, is it, in terms of building relationships? Okay, the aid, quite often parents want to have an aid, you know, well, I'll put that aid working with a child. Actually, what's been shown, this is a bit scary, is that if an aid is seated next to the child, the actual outcome is worse than no aid at all, socially and academically, because the child learns to be helpless. In other words, someone else. I think we'd all like to have a personal helper in the classroom. Okay, obviously doesn't help if the child's being taught a separate curriculum, and there's a whole range of image things like being the autistic kid, the runner or whatever. And in particular, if you think about children with disabilities, quite often they've got no valued roles. In other words, they're not the ones who go to clean the board and all of those things that Patrick was talking about, all of those wonderful valued roles in the school. They tend not to get them. Okay, what do we know from research about how we build friendships in schools, or particularly for children? Collaborative classroom activities is a very powerful strategy. In other words, children working in groups, because if you're working in groups with your peers, that's much more likely to transact out into the playground afterwards. Whereas if you're working totally separately, much harder for that to go out into the classroom, outside. Volunteer programs, that's in other words, I've never been in a class yet, and this includes teenagers, where there wasn't someone who was willing to volunteer to be engaged with a student with a disability. There are always nice students around who actually will take that role on. It's mainly an issue of how we actually present that and how we engage the other students in actually taking on that role. Group affection activities, in other words, you know, I've seen teachers do this about what do you really like about Mary, and they'll go through every child in the class, not just the child with disability, but all the children in the class, about what is it that you actually like about that particular student. And that builds the inclusion effect. We can teach specific skills. If you think about friendship, there's a lot of things like listening, responding, helping. There's a whole range of skills we can actually teach in relation to that. If we ask students to think about inclusion, like some of the things I've seen teachers do is, I want you to write down every way that you're the same as every other student in the class. Now I want you to write down a way that you're different to every other student in the class. And so they start to then having a conversation about similarity and difference and how we might actually build people more into that. This is one of the most powerful ways, is peer tutoring, particularly class-wide peer tutoring. In other words, you have other students helping students helping each other, particularly if it's class-wide. Now what happens is the academic outcome of all children goes up, because to teach something, you've got to be good at it. So we actually work with that, and that's one of the most powerful strategies, and of course the building relationship when you're working at peer tutoring is quite strong. And then there's other one, which is the circle, which is what I want to talk about today, and let's explain what that is. Patrick was talking about this, I think, in terms of the circle of friends. It was Marsha Forrest and Jack Pierpont. They built a circle of people around Judith Snow. I think that they published a book that was around about 1991, but describing how a person who was very isolated, they built a support circle around, an intentional support circle around Judith to actually make sure that she was supported. The first report I can find in the literature about this in school was in 1992, so it's not an absolutely new idea. But the idea is a voluntary, intentional support group built around a person who's in danger of being socially isolated. Now, it's not expected, there's not an expectation that friendships will develop, although it's very common that they do. And the other thing that's hoped for, and which we define, is to get a ripple effect. As other people start to see a person engaging, one of their friends engaging with a person with a disability, other people start to engage as well. This actual one I want to talk about is an evaluation we did in South Australia. And it was a project set up by the Department of Education and Child Development, or was funded by the Education Department and Child Development in South Australia. And it was run by Purple Orange. I don't know if you've heard of that. It was a Julia Farr Centre in South Australia. And it was actually implemented by the Community Living Association. Some of you may have known or run into Jane Barrett, who was the key person in relation to those. So the idea was that would support a range of students, and the Education Department was particularly interested. It had to be all ages, so 4 to 18. All levels of disability, so from very profound disability right through to limited, autism spectrum, physical disability, intellectual impairment. So they had a wide range of students involved. Government schools, independent schools and Catholic schools. So it was really trying to say that we're going to have all the bases covered in this. And the idea was that they'd build a natural relationship, a circle of friends around people. In particular, the idea for parents in particular was to minimise the chances of isolation and bullying. And for the schools, it was seen as a way of actually building in on top of some of the structures that they already had. In terms of worthwhile thinking about what some of these are obvious, the transitions that occur at school. Clearly, the first day at school, that's a big one. But there's all the class to class, teacher to teacher. Now, even in primary school, it can be teacher to teacher because you may have a music class and then you go back to your mainstream class, etc. Subject to subject, and then into a high school. And I think if you remember your first day in high school, it's pretty scary, wasn't it? This is a major, major transition. Now, in secondary, you've got all of those transitions, but then some other really subtle ones. The changes in gender groupings in high school, or particularly late primary to secondary, there's a change in genders. And what genders do, different genders do, as children get older. So they talk about different things, they do different things as the children get older. The subtleties increase in terms of communication, and quite often these may just go straight over the head of a person with an intellectual impairment, may just not pick up those subtleties. And so it's in danger of being seen as stupid or not getting it, and maybe being made fun of. And we're all very aware that the heightened hearing issues in high school is big, isn't it? So we have to actually work around some of those. So if you think about yourself at high school, when you first start high school, you've got zero social capital unless you've got some other friends around. So you arrive there, you've got no one around, you're the smallest fish in this huge pond, and you really have got no social capital, no social status whatsoever. And you need to start building that up. Now, this is for a student with a disability. This is all the time that the social capital is low. You've got less resources in terms of people around to actually look after you and so forth. So that's a key issue. Another issue is this isn't a continual thing. It's a continually changing as the student gets older. As transitions are not normally just one thing, they're multiple things. So particularly in high school, you've got the teachers change, the peers change, a whole range of things. The aides may change. So we're talking about multiple changes occurring. Now, what we know is that if there's personal support through those transitions, it's much less traumatic, and in particular, peer support is much, much more powerful. So it's much more powerful to have a peer support you through the transitions than your aide or an adult. This all makes sense, doesn't it? That, if your mates are supporting you through those transitions, that's a very, very different sort of feeling. Okay, so in terms of setting this up, obviously it's an intentional support group. It could include older students as well as adults. There was an opening that the thought was that it could actually include adults if that was an appropriate person to have on that actual group. The way it was set up and the findings were that this was quite important. There was a facilitator was actually employed to manage the whole situation. The reason for that was that the facilitator had to work with the families to work out, to get to know the families, the issues, the problems they were having and so forth, to work with the school in terms of what was possible, how it could be managed and so forth, and then to work together with the two of them. For that to actually happen independently was seen as being very, very complex, and maybe a lot of schools in particular thought that that would have probably been outside of their possibility because there's just too much actually going on. In this case, they also set up a family circle, a support circle for families. The rationale for this is that many families of children with disability tend to only have friends of other parents with a child with disability. You tend to be pulled back towards that because they are the only people who get it. And so you tend to, and the idea was for the parents also to have an expanded support group, so there are actually people in the community who will be actually supporting them as well. Okay, in terms of the mechanics of it, was overseen by a steering group. We have an amazing facilitator. She was a teacher, primary school teacher, and so she knew the system. She obviously wasn't teaching then. She also had two children of her own, so she was used to working with children. So she also had an amazing capacity to actually work with families of kids with disability. So we had a gem of a person in terms of that, and certainly I think you would have need certain characteristics to pull this off. You've got to be able to work well with families as well as work well with schools. The way that it was set up was parents were invited to have their child in the program. The children had to be in mainstream school in order to do this, because obviously it was working with mainstream schools and the children being included there. And we had to work on the basis of, Catholic schools, independent schools, range of ages, etc. So the parents and the families had to be somewhat selected to meet the requirements of the funding. Once the families were agreed and they sort of went on to it, then the facilitator went and negotiated with that child's particular school. And then from that, the circle was selected and the facilitator met regularly with the teachers, family, staff, etc. Okay, so at the time that I did the evaluation, there were 7 children involved. 2 had just, that was a plus of 2 that had just started that I didn't actually get to connect with. 6 schools. So the facilitator, as you can imagine, was working crazy all over the place, driving half a day. Range of schools, primary, high, etc., and a range of disabilities. And even though all the schools were in Adelaide, some were in the hills and some were in so it was quite a lot of driving involved. Just in terms of how we actually did the evaluation, in case you wanted to do something similar, we did it by formal interviews, so that actually these were tape recorded interviews with the families, school staff and members of the steering group, and then also a whole range of informal interviews which weren't recorded because it's scary to record kids, and I'm not sure about permissions, etc. The student circle members and the other members of the actual team there, where that was much more of an ongoing conversation all the time. And I didn't have enough time to actually interview people from their parent circles, but I did get some indirect feedback from that group. Just in terms of how we end up with 25 hours of interview material. What do you do with 25 hours of interview material? The way that that's handled is to write individual issues that were raised on a card, 1 issue per card, and I ended up with a pile of cards about that height, and then we sorted them into themes, with these recurring themes, and then from that, those themes were then sent out to everyone who was interviewed and said, is this an accurate reflection of what you told me? And so we could get a check that I wasn't making something up. Basically that all went well. There's no one had any problem about what we'd actually sent back. Okay, so let's look at what actually happened, and hopefully we'll have a bit of time to actually talk about this and what it might do with it. Impacts on the student with a disability, what it seemed to do was act as a relationship starter. That the child may not have the skills to actually start a relationship. That even they may want to have a relationship, the skills to actually start a relationship are quite complex, aren't they? When you think about it, that's much harder than having a friend to actually start that friendship relationship. So the actual having a group of students around who were intentionally there meant that hurdle was in fact automatically overcome. Now, this is really important after grade 5. If you've watched very young children, they automatically make friends. They just zoom straight in, they're into it, and they're doing everything together. Except for, in some cases, some kids maybe with Asperger's or some autism behaviours where they've just got such low social skills that they really blow it right from the beginning. After grade 5, however, there's this really interesting thing that happens, and we'll come back to it a little bit, is that the gender split. If you watch kids around about grade 5, boys and girls start to split. Now that means you lose half your potential friends. So that this can be quite, particularly as like a boy may have lots of girlfriends because they may be more, wanting to look after him. So this can become a major issue. The second major one we come into is in high school, and we'll come back to that, where there's really, really major issues come in. What did we find? We found the other students would automatically build the student into games, and so that there would be handball going on or whatever. There would be an automatic, oh come on, come and join us. So whereas before that student may have been just wandering around the playground, now we were finding that this actual student was actually being pulled in. And this was modelling to other students who would then start to also join in with this particular student. So there was a ripple effect, which was quite good. In terms of the most power, tended to be very much related to the classroom. This issue of the engaged in the same curriculum and interacting in the classroom tends to be a very powerful one. In other words, if you're together with working on a problem in the class, much more likely to go out in the playground. Whereas if you're separated, much less likely. And when teachers actually did a lot of group stuff or peer tutoring, etc., what we found was that the likelihood of that relationship going out was much, much higher. Yeah, so it very much depended on the teacher. Some teachers were terrific at this, and other teachers tended to basically see the student as somewhat separate. Okay, what did the parents think? Parents reported a growth in skills. So in other words, they reported that the social skills of their son or daughter were increasing. And the students were less dependent on teacher aids, and in fact tended to become a bit rejecting of teacher aids. And the other kids would tend to push them out as well, which was quite nice, you know, that, oh, I'll do that, I'll help him out, or, you know, there was a bit of pressure to build a separation with a teacher aid, which of course is what independence is about, where you're actually working separate to that. The peers knew what was going on, that these guys would say, you know, with their aid, they say, oh, I can't do that, can I? And the kids would say, oh, don't give us that, John, you can do that. And they would actually, they'd bust him for, you know, saying he was less incompetent. They wouldn't let him get away with it. Yeah, now one of the disappointing things that was found, and this is where we're sort of going now, is that the generalisation outside of the school wasn't very good. In other words, there was a little bit of stuff outside of school, birthday parties, but birthday parties you like once a year, you know, they're not sort of all the time things. We weren't finding that there was this really good transition outside of school, so clearly we need to think of doing some more specific stuff around there. Yeah, so we had one very clear relationship that extended outside of school and so forth, but in the majority of cases it was a bit limited, and the parents were in fact a bit disappointed about that. What did the effect on the other students? Everyone I interviewed was really positive about it. They thought it was a really good idea. They enjoyed being on it. They said they'd learned a lot. The teachers reported that the students were really brought out really good characteristics of the other kids in terms of being helpful and supportive and so forth. They had quite a lot of good understanding about what it meant. Is that, you know, difference doesn't matter, you know, there's sort of and so forth. Schools were very supportive. They went into it with a really, I suppose, on the basis of being quite positive anyway. But particularly the schools that were based on religious values, they were very positive in terms of that they saw it as really building on the moral values and the moral mission of the school as being very good. And they didn't build any major negatives. There was one issue with one family where it was a bit conflicted, but actually that's actually settled down really well. Yeah, so in terms of what was the effect on the parents reported that in almost all cases the partnership with the school had improved, which is really positive, because if you get a good partnership with the school, the probability of this working is massively much greater. They built trust with teachers. Where a lot of the conflict comes is where you have a teacher wanting to do something and the parent not wanting that to happen. And that's an area, if there's trust built, then first of all, the parent's going to be the teacher's going to be much more likely to listen to the parent, why they've got concerns, and also the parent's going to be much more likely to give the teacher a go and sort of, okay, have a go, and we'll see how it works. The parent circles, parents reported that they were useful, but most of them said, well, we probably wouldn't have done it unless you sort of really wanted us to do. You know, that was considered unnatural sort of thing. But, after they'd done it, they said, no, it was actually quite good. And some of the relationships with members of the community actually improved as a result of that. So it's quite interesting. Facilitator, it was certainly the schools in particular saw this as being essential. So I think if a school's going to do it, they need to have someone who's actually organised to actually fill that role. To actually just start this without that might be a little bit difficult from what we were finding, because they need to know the family and the child, do all the negotiations, and they can be minefields. Any parent who's negotiating with school knows it's a minefield. Build relationships with teachers, because they had to be able to go into the school and sort of say, look, mum's got a bit of a problem here, there's a bit of negotiation going on like that. They had to assist in setting up the circle. They would gather ideas from the parents, which they would then try in the school, so there's a bit of a negotiation, because if a parent comes along to a teacher and says, why don't you, it doesn't work, you know, because then it's a fixed roles, whereas another teacher coming along and saying, you know, mum's wanting this, any way we could do it, then we could find those sorts of things were actually happening. The coordinator attended the circle meetings, and most important, met regularly with everyone. So met regularly with a circle of kids, and started to plan strategically as issues came up. If there were issues coming up, then they would actually start to plan what to do about it. Because in any situation with relationships, they'll break down. For example, some kids were found on the circle, found to not be the best kids to be put on there. Other situations you may have the kids dropped out of the circle and so forth. These things had to be foreseen and actually dealt with. What do we learn about these circles? Age. The decision made was not to have younger children than the person with a disability, because of the danger of them being imaged as forever a child. So the age was always the same age, or in some cases, most cases actually, one or two kids of an older age, because they could fulfil the role of mentor, and also gave them a bit of status. If you had a mate who was in the class 2 ahead, 1 or 2 ahead, that was pretty good status, and so it actually had some value. On the other hand, same ages, that's where you make your friends, isn't it? Much more likely to make friendships out of the same age. It was interesting. I thought gender might come up as an issue, that every single student I ever asked said, no, it doesn't make a difference. Boys, girls, doesn't matter. A friend's a friend, which was quite interesting. Same with different classes, obviously there's some advantage in the same class, there's some advantage in a different class because you're actually expanding the network out to include other students. A specific decision was made not to have other students with a disability for the obvious reasons that, you know, be seen as, or put the kids with a disability together on the basis of having disability. There was one example where that wasn't followed, where there was just a natural relationship formed with a student in another class who also had a disability, and said, okay, that's fine, it's a natural relationship formed naturally, we'll go with it, but there certainly was an avoidance of putting people together on the basis of having a disability. What's best? What's personality? This is quite interesting, because parents generally want to have nice kids on their circle. You know, that we're going to be looking after them and protect them and so forth. But of course, that doesn't stretch the child. And so, what was found was there needs to be a balance. There need to be some students who are really protective and nice kids, all those kids that you have, but also kids who push them a bit. And maybe, you know, bounce them around a bit, who are going to get into a bit of rough stuff with them and so forth, and stretch them. And yeah, that was some interesting discussions between the facilitator and the school and the parents around those sorts of issues about what was best to do that. Who chooses? Well, I think it's got to be a partnership. Parents know their child, obviously, better than anyone else. but parents also know the other kids better than the parent does. And so that joining those two groups together and making a decision jointly, as well as obviously the child having a high involvement in that decision making, but not total. When it was total choice of the child, you know, who they wanted to be in their group, there was, particularly with younger kids, there was a bit of manipulation going on. You know, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to kick you out of my group. You know, there's these sorts of games. So there's lots of interesting dynamics were going around. Circle size. There was a whole range of sizes up to about 12, and that seemed to work in some cases. But most people seem to think about 5 or 6 in a circle is a good number. The reason for that is it's too small. Then one person leaves and you're in deep trouble. You may have a relationship lost. Too big and maybe it just becomes a bit of everyone's talking to each other rather than focusing around the individual. Okay, when a circle's most important, around about grade 2, students start to choose who their friends are. So that might be a time when if a person's struggling in how to make friends, that might be a good time that an actual circle is developed. Particularly in grade 5, or around about that time, depending on the maturation of the students, the gender split, and it may be very important that there's an adult involved there to make sure that the relationships the current relationships are kept and new relationships are developed with the same genders. With the kids in the circle, this seemed to happen less. Because they're intentionally there, that problem seemed to be minimised as a result of the circle. At all transitions, obviously, having a circle of friends who are going through there, or at least can help you through that, that's a major issue. And if you think about when you normally make new relationships, it's normally transitions, isn't it? And so if you've got an actual support group around that time, that is actually a very powerful way of going. Now, peer attitudes are critical. In a high school, what happens is that you're in great danger of, as a student, aren't you, with a relationship. You're highly likely, if you make friends with a child with a disability, you may cop it. Why are you hanging around with that person, etc. So you find that students are in so much danger themselves in terms of that they will tend to pull back from that. However, if we approach them, then they can say, I'm meeting up with him because the teacher told me to do it. That then gives them the permission to actually do that, and it all works. So that seems to be a key thing in high school. Relationships are very, very dicey. Some adult intervention does seem to be absolutely critical in terms of actually ensuring that relationships can be established. Parents support the circle at all ages. So overall, basically, we came out that it was a pretty powerful way of actually developing relationships around a person, and certainly in terms of around the school situation, the playground, there was lots of things happening and so forth. It's done over, as you see, multiple schools, ages, types of school, etc. So it seemed to be appropriate on all. Partnerships seem to be the key. And we've just finished some research where we surveyed teachers right around the country, and these were teachers who were doing good work on inclusion. We had nearly 200 of them. And we asked them what was the most important, what was the thing that made the most difference in terms of successful inclusion. Number 1, partnership with parents. Number 2, partnership with colleagues. And then you got down to aids and all that other stuff. So the people who are doing it well and really know what they're doing, partnerships are actually critical. Facilitator does seem to be required. Maybe you can do it without it, but this situation seemed to be that the facilitator was critical. Trust. And the last thing there was really interesting that this issue comes out, should they do NAPLAN? You know, that type of question, when we know they're going to fail, that's the type of question. And I wouldn't have been sure what to say there, but the students were very clear. Yeah, it's fair, I know I'm not as good as the others, so it's fair I get a poorer mark. It was really interesting. So it was just a different perspective. So that gives you a bit of an idea of sort of what we found, and yeah, it seemed to be quite, and potentially I think also for new migrants coming in England without a second language, etc. So, any questions? It would depend on the situation, but quite often the child would be approached directly by the teacher or by the facilitator. So it would actually go and say, would you like to join a circle? And they had the choice to say no, because obviously it was not going to work if they didn't want to be there. So it was totally up to them, but it was an invite directly by mainly by the facilitator, but occasionally by the teacher. Yep. One of the things that we've found is that in inclusion is quite often the quite rough kids, maybe even a bully, can actually be one of the best supporters because it actually softens them. It's really quite amazing. I've just seen so many kids who are seen as being the problem kid soften as a result of being given the role of, you know, can you look after Harry sort of thing. It's quite interesting. Yeah. As with all these things, you know, there's recurrent funding issues. There's a real worry that this will actually, the facilitator won't be refunded. One of the things that came out of it though was that maybe it can be maintained by the school once it's up and running, and the relationship with the families is quite good. You can probably maintain it, but to actually establish it, their feeling was you'd actually need a facilitator to get it going. The private schools were rated as doing a better job even though they had less resources. And it seemed to be that relationship issue and the moral issue was the more important issue. If you want the child there, we can work it out. That seems to be the core issue. And just after 20 years of working with this, I look for the will. If I've got the will, I can give them the skill. If I haven't got the will, yeah, you need a priest or something. I don't know. What's really quite interesting about the research, and this blew in my mind, because I actually set up the first school for kids with multiple disabilities in WA. So, you know, I come from a special education background, and I actually used to run the autism early intervention service in Perth, etc. So I come from very much a special education. We did a research review, and you can actually download it from my website, which is we cannot find, going back over, we went right back to 1933, we cannot find one research study comparing segregation and inclusion that comes out in favour of segregation. So this is just mind-blowing. Yes, almost everything. Certainly they're key in terms of selecting the group, because they don't want the student on their circle. It's probably not going to work anyway. Yes, I mean they're heavily involved, depending on the age of the child. I mean, if you've got a child with multiple disabilities, as we had in kindergarten, then it was much more others involved. When we had another 18-year-old who was totally competent, he absolutely managed the whole lot. So yeah, very, very much. Mum bought a house next door to hers. Her son moved in there with two mates from school, living there, and they set up a business together, where in fact he's actually demonstrates to other families how you can actually do communication boards, and the students spruik it. They run the workshop, you know, the verbal stuff, and he actually demonstrates it. So I mean, that would be one example where it did go way past. So it certainly can. But as we know, it's hard.
Friends, making new friends and new relationships at school. What if they met at school and they end up being together once they graduate?
Yeah, in Canberra they've got another group that's called the Bunch of Mates, and they've just got a different terminology. But they're actually spending a lot of time to try and build them into the same clubs as the other kids, and so the actual relationships are outside of the school, as well as also having it in the school. And I think that's where we've got to go. We've actually got to try and build it much broader than just in the classroom. Yeah. So it's a big issue. Absolutely formal times. In terms of training, now it was discussions. In other words, would be, how can we involve him more in the handball or something out in the playground? And then that was the discussion, and then the students would come in with ideas and so forth. So yeah, I think we've got to take a step back when we're talking about relationships amongst kids. Kids know about that. Our role is to actually build a willingness to engage with that, and then step back and let them do it. Yeah. And I mean, the school obviously they would let the students out from other classes, and they would come and meet, and in their little room or something. They'd talk it over, what was actually going on, so that the actual school would support that relationship, and then the teacher, the whole school population would tend to be keeping a bit of an eye out as well, because they all knew about this, so that there was a bit of make sure that they were engaging in the playground and so forth, and if not, it would maybe be brought back to the circle and sort of say, he was out there by himself today, can we, So that would be the level of engagement, I think. Well, I was in a school over in Canberra where they were actually having that discussion about whether in fact they needed to change the mix in terms of teacher aides versus maybe support for the teachers and so forth. So the issue of the teacher aides, they can be like gold. I don't want to put down teacher aides because I've seen some teacher aides actually change kids' lives. If they're working for independence and if they're working towards this, building relationships. So if the teacher aide sees their role as, by the end of term, I want him working independently through the whole of the lesson, and he's engaging with kids in the playground or in class, those people can be gold. But if they sit next to a student, they teach helplessness, to be quite honest. I mean, that's really what the outcome is. So it's how they use. They can be gold or they can be something gets in the way. One of the issues that I think is quite interesting, that the better the school gets at inclusion, the less IEPs you have, because he's a kid. And like every kid, he needs something individualised, and they let go of this thing. So I'm sure that as parents, you know all about IEPs, that sit there and they drag out 6 months later and they say, yeah, we were going to do that, weren't we? And nothing actually happened. Whereas if teachers engage with the student and the other students are engaged, we find a lot of those things actually just become part of the natural course of the life,